Step aside Merc and make way for the ninja. Hello, I'm OzChris and welcome to my review of Intermission, the DLC for Final Fantasy VII Remake Intergrade. This review is solely going to be about Intermission and not about the re-release of the remake as Intergrade. Additionally, I'm not the biggest fan or knowledgeable about Final Fantasy, particularly Final Fantasy VII or any of its characters, so I'll be judging Intermission on its own entirety, just for what we are given and what we are shown in this DLC. So, Intermission follows the story of Yuffie Kasaragi, a ninja and materia hunter for Wutai, as she infiltrates Midgar alongside fellow ninja Sonon Kusakabe in order to find Shinra's ultimate materia. Storyline-wise, the events of Intermission take place after the Mako Reactor 5 bombing and before the Sector 7 platefall, with several characters from the core game making appearances and references are being made to certain events in this DLC. Intermission is comprised of two chapters, Wutai's Finest and Covert Ops. Wutai's Finest introduces our main characters and their planning of sneaking into Shinra's labs, while Covert Ops focuses on our two leads as they attempt to navigate said labs to search for the ultimate materia. So let's begin with our main protagonist, the cute little Moogle ninja, Yuffie.
Known as a beguiling ninja, this is the world's greatest materia hunter. But who am I truly? Well, excited onlookers wonder no more. Before you see the rare wound, the single white rose of Wutai, the one and only Yuffie.
I'm not familiar with Yuffie in any of the other Final Fantasy games or media, but I gotta say, I absolutely enjoy Yuffie. This hyperactive, cute little sister-esque ninja won my heart over as soon as she was introduced. She's a bundle of joy, she's a lot of fun and great, as is her combat playstyle. Putting into basics, she's a mix of Tifa and Aerith's playstyles in the main game, close quarters melee attacks and long range magic attacks. Yuffie's primary weapons are shurikens, which she can use in close quarters combat, but alternatively, she can throw it at a target to have it constantly hit them, while she changes to long range magic attacks. Additionally, if you go to retrieve your shuriken to return back to a close quarters combat style, you can actually use this to cut and close the distance between an enemy. So if an enemy is probably 5 meters away from you, you can easily pretty much jump straight towards them when you go to retrieve your shuriken. Coupled with her Art of War, Windstorm and Banishment abilities, Yuffie's playstyle is not only easy to use and master, but it's loads of fun. One minor gripe though I would give to Yuffie's abilities is that they are a tad bit overpowered. Don't get me wrong, I do like feeling like a god sometimes in games. You know, I'm looking at you, Virgil, in DMC5 Special Edition.
Pathetic.
But a lot of these attacks, even before you get different weapons, are incredibly strong, especially Windstorm. And also a lot of the enemies are weak to both melee and Windstorm. So essentially you are powerful without having to grind up to that level, which I think they did this purposely considering there's only 2 chapters to this game. So they're not expecting you to play through like hours and hours and hours, like in the base game of leveling up, finding different weapons, using different abilities. So they're just going to give you the powerful abilities from the get-go. And you get other weapons, becomes even more powerful. Moving on to our second ninja, Sonon.
I'm back.
Ah, there you are. Someone's been expecting you.
What took you?
Sorry about that.
What?
Just thinking how you're nothing like your old man. Anyway, it's nice to meet you. I'm Sonon Kusakabe.
Sonon is the more, well, reasonable of the two. He's more calm compared to the hyperactive youngster that is Yuffie, and despite being the eldest of the two, he respects Yuffie and values her experience over his own. His combat playstyle is similar to Yuffie's, close quarters melee and long range magic. However, unlike the other party members in the base game, you cannot switch over to play as Sonon, only controlling what abilities, spells and or items he can use, if he doesn't use them himself. However, Intermission adds a new combat technique exclusive for Yuffie and Sonon called Synergy. By pressing the left trigger on your controller, Yuffie and Sonon synchronize attacks, and if both have at least 1 bar of ATB full, they can perform more powerful tag team versions of Yuffie's Art of War and windstorm abilities. Additionally, if you do certain side quests, you can get a materia that gives Yuffie and Sonon the ability to cannonball. Literally, Yuffie will just jump onto his staff and Sonon will throw her at the enemy. Pretty cool, right? An added bonus to Sonon is that if Yuffie is downed by an enemy combatant, he will sacrifice his remaining HP to revive you. So he essentially does a life transference version of Phoenix Down. So that's pretty neat. Despite Intermission being only 2 chapters long that take about 5 hours to complete combined, the DLC does a great job of building up the pseudo-sibling relationship between Yuffie and Sonon, enough to make you really care about the two and what can happen to them, especially to Sonon. Okay, so I'm going into some spoiler territory, so you were warned. 3, 2, 1. So at the end of the game, after defeating Nero, no, not that Nero, yes, this Nero, the one who looks like if Makoto from Rurouni Kenshin decided he wanted to cosplay as an insane asylum e-boy with skeletal wings. So Yuffie and Sonon defeat Nero and prepare to leave Shinra, but Sonon realizes that Nero is alive, and to protect Yuffie from a sneak attack, he sacrifices himself. I was genuinely shocked when it happened. Like, here, this was my reaction during a stream of it happening, of me playing this game. Despite the short amount of time we had with Sonon, his bond with Yuffie, coupled with the loss of his sister, made me feel for that moment, and I was actually quite upset at his death. And the DLC did a great job of building this up in my opinion, despite the fact we only have a short time with these characters. Moving on to the big bads of this DLC, Yuffie and Sonon's main adversary comes in the form of Scarlet. In the base game, while she is an antagonist, Scarlet doesn't particularly play a direct role as one to Cloud or his party, compared to someone like Heidegger or Hojo. Intermission gives Scarlet time to shine as an antagonist, being a core roadblock to Yuffie and Sonon in the 2nd chapter, as well as having an indirect history with the latter of the two. I'll give props to this DLC for fleshing out Scarlet a bit more and have her be more of a direct antagonist compared to the base game where she's just, I'm a bad guy, and look at my great assets. Granted, they are great, but I need a bit more from a villain. I enjoyed her interaction with the protagonist, and it was such a joy to finally defeat her towards the end of the game, where it's literally 2 ninjas versus mechs and a whole lot of other, like, robots. It is a really fun, great fight. The last 2 antagonists are Vice and Nero, the 2 brothers of Deep Ground. Aside from their cool designs, there isn't much to these 2 brothers, with Nero thrown in shortly after the Scarlet boss fight, and Vice being relegated to a hard mode combat simulator fight after the completion of Intermission. In my opinion, these 2 felt really tacked onto this DLC and were unnecessary aside from an aforementioned act that Nero contributes to, with their purpose either to build up mystery to a plot point in part 2 of the remake, or another DLC story, or they're just a reference to having been in a previous Final Fantasy VII game or media connected to it. Hell, when Nero mentions Deep Ground, I didn't even know what that was. I just assumed by how they're introduced that he and Vice are part of some secret Shinra experiment. When looking up what Deep Ground is, I was kinda right, but I don't particularly like when it feels like with games that I have to do additional homework outside of it to understand what's going on here. The biggest abuser of this was Halo 5 Guardians, where you would have had to read comics, books, watch a mini-series, listen to these audio stories, all of this just to kind of not only to understand who these new characters are in the game, but also the plot to a degree. This wasn't as bad, but I was questioning what the hell is Deep Ground, and was this in the base game? Which technically, yes, it was. Deep Ground was in the base game in the form of some of their experiments that they're doing, but I must have zoned out, even with having did a recent replay of Final Fantasy VII. I couldn't remember what Deep Ground was, so I wish they went in a bit more with what Deep Ground was. You can't say they were pressed for time, because this DLC only takes you about 5, maybe 6 hours to play, so they could have added something there about Deep Ground and really give an actual reason to why these brothers are in this DLC. So In my honest opinion, Scarlet should have just been the only antagonist, given she spends more time against the two protagonists, as well as I mentioned earlier, having an indirect history with Sonon. Like with the base game, there are optional minigames to play or side quests to complete. One such minigame is Fort Condor, a tower defense-esque board game where each player summons troops to take out each other's towers, with a player winning by either having more towers remaining after the timer expires, or by destroying the opponent's main headquarters. The troops you use are all based off Shinra enemy types and come in 3 different attack categories: melee, range, and shield, each weak to a certain one. Melee is weak to shield is weak to range, etc, etc. The opponents you face in this minigame are characters from the base game such as Kyrie, Wedge, and even Roche. Or Roche? Yeah, cool hair guy on the motorbike. That guy.
But I can tell you that he has a real need for speed, as they say.
The side quest in this minigame is to face off against each opponent, beating them until you can face off against the mysterious Grandmaster of Fort Condor. Additionally, beating opponents can result in obtaining Condor coins, the DLC's equivalents to Moogle medals from the base game, which can only be used in Old Snapper's shop to buy more Fort Condor equipment or more usable items. And speaking of Old Snapper, the turtle costume promoter himself for the Happy Turtle Bar has a side quest for Yuffie: locate some missing posters. Yeah, that's essentially it. And there's another minigame located in Chapter 2. It is a version of the box breaking minigame that was in the base game, where you break boxes to score a certain amount of points in order to obtain various different prizes. And just like in the base game, Chadley returns for a VR mission for Yuffie and co, where you can face off against the Lightning Lord of Levin, Ramu. Ramu can pose quite a challenge if you decide to face off against him early on solo as Yuffie, so I'd recommend fighting him once Sonon joins the party. As always with the VR missions, defeat Ramu to be able to summon this giant lightning Gandalf to shock and zap all your foes. So despite the short length of the DLC, I thoroughly enjoyed every moment of Intermission. The characters were great to play as and see bounce off from one another. The story was engaging, and the combat, while a little overpowered in parts, was a lot of fun to experience. And I haven't even gotten to the visuals. Just like in the base game, the visuals of Intermission are absolutely gorgeous and a spectacle to behold. The addition of it being the PS5 really enhances the entire look of the game, boosting how amazing the game's appearance originally was. After you complete Intermission, you get a couple of rewards, aside from a chapter selection, which kind of feels meaningless when there's only 2 chapters to this DLC, but I digress. The first reward comes in a form of a challenge in the combat simulation room in the base game. So in chapter 17 of the base game, Chadley will tell you that he's added a new simulation challenge to the room, but it is quite a difficult one, considering you can only do it on hard mode. What is the fight? Well, I've mentioned it already. It's against Vice. So pick your team members and see if you can go up against the leader of Deep Ground. So how did I go? Well... yeah, I was absolutely decimated by Vice. It probably didn't help that I was only about level 38 with the majority of my characters, so I believe I was probably under-leveled for this fight, considering I haven't played the game on hard. I've only done it on just the standard normal difficulty, so I didn't think that there'd be any way for me to defeat Vice. I just wanted to see how far I could go. But yeah, so far it is quite challenging. I don't know if that's going to be any different if I've leveled up a bit more, but maybe one day I'll get back to fighting the Immaculate One and finally defeat him. The second reward for completing Intermission is access to the combat simulation room at the start of Chapter 2. When going through your first playthrough of Chapter 2, there will be a room that you cannot access, even though you could see that you can go into this room on the minimap. Well, that's a combat simulation room, which only opens once you've completed the DLC. Go inside, there is a few challenges to partake in, 2 normal ones, and then a hard one where Yuffie and Sonon can go up against the dragon god himself, Bahamut. Yeah, much like the Vice one, it's very challenging. Actually, surprisingly, as Yuffie and Sonon, considering how overpowered they are, actually lasted a bit longer compared to the Vice one, but I ended up, as the kids would say, eating shit. Now, before I conclude this review, I want to talk about a couple of things I disliked about Intermission, particularly a couple of things that happened in Chapter 2. The first of which is the lead up to the Scarlet boss fight. Before you get to fight the woman with the greatest assets in the world, she puts you through some trials. What are these trials? Well, you're given a choice between two different enemy combatants. You pick one of them, you fight them, you get another selection between another two enemy combatant types. You do this about 4 times, I believe, before you reach the end of the trials and fight an enemy I believe is exclusive to the DLC called Death Wheel. Now, I understand what the point of these trials are. They're supposed to test how strong you've gotten at this point, or at least that's how I perceived it to be. But as I've mentioned earlier in this review, you are overpowered from the get-go, and at this point in the game, nothing phases you. There is no chance of you being downed by any enemy unless you are not looking after your HP. So these trials come off less challenging and more of a tedious roadblock. Hell, Death Wheel is nothing compared to you, considering the fact that your Windstorm ability is one of its main weaknesses, and from what I've looked up, doing long range magic will actually help build up the stagger bar. So, like I said, this felt like more of a tedious roadblock before I got to fight Scarlet. The second thing I disliked was the combat simulation room fight. After the Scarlet fight and before the Nero fight, you will be cornered and trapped inside of a combat simulation room. In order to escape, you need to fight through the simulation to destroy the projector. You destroy the projector, the simulation ends, the door opens, you can escape. Now, despite the fact that Intermission has a short runtime, this segment of it really feels like they tried to draw it out. They needed it to be longer. It did, at least from how I perceived it, it felt like they thought, well, we're at 4 hours and 50 minutes, but we want it to be at 5 hours. We need it to be on a nice, neat hour mark. So let's just do a variation of one of the combat simulation challenges in Chapter 17 of the base game. Do that. That's what it felt like. Don't get me wrong, I kind of dig the boss fight. While it is simple, there is an interesting mechanic to it, where you have to defeat the boss. That will allow the projector to be damaged because it's invincible throughout the entirety of the fight until the boss is downed. Do some damage, it will become invincible again. It will respawn the boss, rinse repeat until the projector is destroyed. But apart from that, much like with the trials, it just felt like a tedious roadblock to the Nero boss fight. It just felt like it was just buying time before you got to the end of the game. So those things I disliked about Intermission, but don't get me wrong, I don't hate them, I just dislike them, and they didn't ruin my overall perception and thoughts of Intermission. For those of you who enjoyed Final Fantasy VII Remake, I would definitely recommend this DLC. Although unfortunately at the time being it seems like Intermission is PS5 exclusive, and given that there is a short to non-existent supply of those consoles, it's unfortunate that not everyone can get to experience hands-on the story of this lovable materia hunting ninja. Maybe they'll decide to release the DLC onto PS4, hopefully. I'd like more people to be able to play this if they don't have a PS5 or don't want to spend an egregious amount of money on scalpers. Regardless, Intermission is a great addition to the world of Final Fantasy VII Remake, and I can't wait to see Yuffie in future installments of this series.
Also, I'm pretty hot stuff myself, thank you very much.
So those were my thoughts on Final Fantasy VII Remake Intergrade Intermission. Boy, that's a mouthful to say. So what are your thoughts? I'd like to see them in the comments. Do you agree with what I said? Do you disagree? Do you feel like I've left out anything in particular? Don't forget to subscribe, hit the like button. You can check me out on Twitch. I stream fairly regularly. You can check out also the podcast. I'm on The Minorities Report, I co-host with my buddy Corrupt. Thank you everyone for watching this video. Hope you enjoyed it, and I will see you all in the next one. Bye.
The amazing Yuffie wants you. Join her team and the sky's the limit.